The first thing I'd like to say, to follow on from Mary, is that looking at the standards of proficiency for midwives is and will be a political act. So I would also implore you all to look at them, read them, and think what implications there are for our future. So I'm going to talk about my political journey using 3 stories, and I'll outline my interpretation of midwifery politics. And I've never done this presentation before, so I'm terribly nervous. I want to talk a little bit about hierarchy or collectivity and community, touching on activism and feminism and the power of reading. And if I've got time, 2 more stories, summary and close. So my herstories of becoming political, I'm going to describe the story of the hoist and the director of nursing, the incident of the midwife and the hairy legs, and refusal to play along, describing the woman with the beautiful red hair and tears. So the story of the hoist and the director of nursing was that I was doing my nurse training, and I was training in Edinburgh and learning about holistic care, Virginia Henderson's Activities of Daily Living, and I bought it wholesale. I believed in holistic care. However, what I was seeing when I went to work in a care of the elderly hospital was, I know this is a man in the bed, but imagine it's an elderly lady, people being lifted in hoists and taken to the toilet and the bathroom with their private parts in public view and queuing outside the door waiting to go to the toilet or have their bath before they were put in bed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I just thought, this is cruel, this is unethical, this is terrible. So, on a regular basis, I used to visit the director of nursing. I must have been a terribly annoying student. And I used to ask, well, how can you let this happen? You're teaching me this, but I'm seeing that. So how do we change it? And I suppose the first thing is by talking about it. The second one is the incident of the midwife and the hairy legs. Here's a small picture of me walking into a nursery. It was a summer back in the 80s. It was really hot and I didn't want to wear tights. It felt unhealthy. And so off came my tights, as did many of my colleagues. And we got into quite a lot of trouble about it. Because we were told, if you don't wear your tights, I'm afraid this is the only picture of a nursing sister I could find, or a midwifery sister, was that you must wear your tights because hairy legs are unsightly. Well, that got our backs up very much so. But when we argued the toss about hairy legs being unsightly, and I do have to admit I dyed mine blonde, that we were told, well, if you're working in the neonatal unit, there is flora, so you need to wear your tights. But none of the doctors wore tights. So this is an example of power and who holds the power and who doesn't. So we all refused to wear our tights and no more was said. Now I want to describe the story of the woman with the beautiful red hair. My picture doesn't do it justice, and these are just from the website. I was called into a room where I later discovered there was a CTG monitor on this woman hidden under the blankets. As I walked into the room, she was facing me, tears rolling down her cheeks, in a lot of pain. I could smell feces in the room, so I figured the birth is pretty imminent. And I was absolutely shocked. I was a consultant midwife at that time, but I had worked in Botswana where I thought I'd seen it all. But here in a big maternity unit in the Midlands was this situation where women were lying abandoned in their beds while the monitor was so-called monitoring or looking after them. It was dreadful. Anyway, I stayed with her, sorted her out, and baby was born. And I decided at that point that I could no longer go along with looking after several women at once and moving from one crisis to the next crisis to the next crisis on acute, busy labour wards. I found it was unethical, and as a consultant midwife, how was I to teach people to do that? Because that is not midwifery. I wasn't very popular, but there it goes. So what is politics? Well, Wikipedia says it's the activities associated with the governance of a country or area, especially the debate between parties having power. There was no big surprise there, but it didn't really touch me particularly. But the Collins Dictionary talked about competition between competing interest groups or individuals for power and leadership. And there I felt that was touching a nerve in terms of who holds the power, who are our leaders, and how are we as grassroots midwives, and how are mothers in this situation. So I would argue that being a midwife is a political act. Midwifery, imagine midwifery is a feminist profession. We work with women every day of our working lives. Midwives should align themselves with mothers and not trusts. And I'm sure our new standards of proficiency, if we take them literally, will help us to do that. Midwives have a duty to be candid and to speak up, but how easy is it to do that? And we have a duty to implement the evidence, and how easy is it to do that? So being political means stepping outside of your comfort zone, Being willing to work in true partnership with mothers, even where their choices don't tally with yours. And I did a presentation here last year, a case study of a mother over 3 births where her final choices were certainly not what I would have chosen for her. And you can probably see that on the website. Embracing risk as well as maintaining safety. There's always this notion of risk that creates fear, but we need to be open to the possibilities for learning that embracing risk creates. And we need to reflect and learn from our mistakes. Be your own critic before others criticize you. And analyze your own practice. Know how to, and know, very importantly, how to defend your practice. Why have you not done what you've not done? Or why have you done what you've done? We have so much evidence to support our midwifery practice. So to empower mothers, midwives must release their power. But how do we do that? Well, maybe through collective action, talking with like-minded people. And connectivity, attending conferences like you all are today. And Sue said, if you're here on your own, talk to people you've never met before. And if you're here with all your friends, move away from them and talk to people you've never met before. Because that's how you find out what's happening in other areas. Reading widely and sharing your learning with colleagues and mothers is really enabling. And it broadens your horizons. And it helps you to see that many roads lead to Rome. The way that you have learnt in your school of midwifery is not always the only way it is for women to have normal birth or to give birth. So it's about realising the art of the possible. And there are these groups that can help and support you to do that, so you're not doing it alone. Sorry. Let's give you a second. So the NHS is currently, and has been for a very long time, been a political football held by those in power. But who holds the power? Governments, regulators, professional organisations, civil servants, lawyers, hospital management team leaders. I see that doctors is missing from that list, but my most recent copy had doctors there as well. My husband's a doctor, and he said, well, you better move them below the hospital management team, not above them, because he's feeling a bit beleaguered as well. So I think we learn to be at the bottom of this hierarchy, but there are far more of us than them, and this perspective of feeling at the bottom of the hierarchy is disabling. So if we look at it in a different way, or in a collective way, in a community of different organisations, we can maybe break free from that hierarchy. We can replace the hierarchy with collectivity, respecting not just others' roles, but valuing our role and being prepared to challenge and integrate our political will into the discussion about our future. We can face the fear in midwifery and see it for what it is. And I would argue that fear is a strategy to undermine and marginalise mothers and midwives. The flip side to fear is understanding what's going on, and it is important that we do understand what's going on. I'm just pausing for a second, because at the very beginning of my presentation, can I go back? I had a slide, and I don't think it's come up for some reason, and I really don't know why not, but I had a slide of the neighbourhood midwives who were cited in Better Births and Best Births. And I also had a slide, don't know where it's gone, of birth centres and birth centre closures, press releases on all birth centre closures. And that was the context in which this talk was being given, because it is so disheartening. I think when we're talking about continuity of care, we're going to have the standards to support implementing continuity of care, and yet we seem to be under siege at times with birth centres, midwifery-led units closing, and the neighbourhood midwives model of care and their pilot was a leading light in our government documents. So we don't know what's happened yet there, and it's not for me to talk about it, but that was the context in which this presentation has been given. I don't know why those slides haven't come up. So we confuse fear with risk. Taking risk is balanced with judgment and individual decision making, and risk is personal, but fear suppresses. And by being constructive and connecting with others, we're not alone. Unless we forget, the suffragettes achieved votes for women 100 years ago, so use your voice and use your vote. Karen Gwilliland from New Zealand said, being a midwife is a feminist issue, so get on board with it. Being a feminist is a political act, as it opens us up to different possibilities. And little midwives can into great midwives grow. When people, and I'm not calling myself a great midwife, but when you get to stand up here, you've done a fair bit of work in your career, and you think, well, how do I get from being a student midwife to there? And it's a journey, and it's a long and interesting and great journey. So each political act becomes the sum of a bigger whole. To empower, we must find our power. And empowerment is not a gift. You cannot give empowerment to somebody else. It's ours to take. And feminism is about addressing inequalities and addressing the imbalance of power in society, both for ourselves and for women in our care. So I'd like you to develop your passion and read The Politics of Midwifery Education, and read about my proposal for career pathways in midwifery post-registration. I'm beginning to think I sent you the wrong presentation, because there is another slide missing here, which actually expanded on this slide in terms of, I do not believe we can be a Jill of all trades, but I do believe we can provide continuity of care, which I see embedded in the standards of proficiency for midwifery. I believe we can do that, but I don't believe we can do everything. And moving on very quickly, I just want to say, if you're the midwife, the named midwife, providing continuity for women of all, with or without complications, the key is in the additional support that those women may need. Am I the person who's been at case conferences, looking after women in community settings? Am I the midwife to give mag sulfate to somebody with fulminating preeclampsia? I don't think so. I want my colleague to be able to do that, and my colleague also being a midwife who can buddy me and work to give that additional care in practice. So I'm sorry my slide's not there. I've messed up. Reading, by its nature, is a political act, and through reading you broaden your horizons, you discover how practice is much broader than you were ever taught, and it enables you to challenge the "this is how we do it here" culture. And read and listen to others' stories. I saw Anna Barham's topic today. I don't know what Anna's going to be talking about, but I bet she's going to be talking about stories for learning, because it is so powerful. Now, just a couple of other wee stories. This is back in the 1990s when I first saw a birth ball being used in Germany. I'd never seen it in this country. And trying to get a woman off a bed at that time was virtually impossible. And I trained in Edinburgh at the time. It was a good place to train, but it was difficult to move away from the traditional way of doing things. Well, when I saw the ball being used in Germany, I was just astonished at how private and in control the mother was, even though she might still have a CTG on. She had a little bit of aromatherapy, a little of homeopathy, but she sat on that ball and I was rolled over by it. So I brought one back to the UK, and this is my friend Pat using it to great success after having a cesarean first time. But I thought, well, that adage, do one, see one, teach one, I thought if I use the ball, other people will follow my example, but they did not. They just thought I was mad. So I developed a little teaching program about how to use the birth ball. And I described the ball as our equipment. It was one of our tools in our toolbox. The ball as a tool. So I shared my understanding of how and why it works. And now, as you all know, I'll be surprised if there's anybody in this room that hasn't seen a birthing ball in their maternity facility. So spreading the word about good practice is a political act. And now birth balls are mainstream in most units. And being an advocate, again in the proficiencies, Mary talked about the importance of advocacy, and I can't stress that enough myself. Being a woman's advocate and accounting for your practice, they go hand in hand. So when Christine, the woman in the pool, came to our unit because her local unit, refused to allow her to use the pool because she had a reason why they thought she was at risk and should not use the pool. In fact, it was GBS. She won't mind me saying, I'm sure, because we have people here today talking about GBS. We embraced the fact that she wanted to use the pool. We made it possible. She kept the hand with the Enflon out of the pool as much as she could. It was fine, and here she is, fully dilated, and she gave birth very soon after. And the other two pictures, the picture of the twins, Kelly next to her husband. I'm sorry it's such a small picture, and it's not a great picture because we took it virtually in the dark. But Kelly wanted to have her babies in her time when she went into labour. So she got to 41 plus weeks. She was huge. And we planned her water birth for her because not only did she want to have a spontaneous birth of her twins, which is becoming ever rarer, she wanted to use the water. And as the midwife looking after her, I can tell you I did take a gulp at that. But we put a plan in place. Managing risk reduces the fear. And we had plan A, plan B, and plan C, and her babies were born beautifully in the water. So being an advocate and accounting for your practice is a political act. So being political is not about what you should do, because I've come to the conclusion that should confers guilt. It's more about what you could do. Could opens the door to possibilities. It's becoming aware and asking why, and developing your critical faculties. Being prepared to stand up and be counted. And compliance can lead to complacency and burnout. So hold on to your aspirations and stay true to why you became a midwife. As it is not how it has to be. So here are some, I'm nearly finished, some well-known strategies which I'm sure many of you in the room will recognise to tackle bullying behaviours. And some actually aren't about bullying, but I just put them in anyway. I think, now this is if you transfer a woman into hospital, you hand her over to a midwife, the midwife says, well, I'm in charge now. And you turn around and say, well, I think you will find that the mother's in charge, thank you. Oh, that's very interesting when you're being given lots of information as to why you should do something. Thank you very much, but no thank you. Now, if you're looking after a breech, if the breech is not descending, don't mess with it. Have a happy section. That wise advice stood me well in my career. And no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. If you want it done, you can come and do it yourself. I will be filing an abuse claim You need to practice these phrases. And what is your NMC registration number? Well, I write it down. So I've dedicated my presentation today to Mary Cronk as an authentic political midwife. Thank you very much for listening. Go away and be political.